Well, now that we've talked about Article 2 and we've talked about the different requirements and qualifications to be president, some of the roles the president plays, some of the aspects of the interaction that the president has with Congress, what I want to do in this conversation is take you through a few, not all, but a few of the more significant presidents in American history and talk about how they've shaped the office into what it is today, because it is not what it was. First president, you know, has George Washington, and he was as different a president as you can imagine from our modern presidents. He believed that in his role, he had a very high view of the office. He understood that for America to be taken seriously, he as president would have to be the king. That is to say, he had to act like a king, he had to dress like a king, he had to carry himself like a king. Our first capital was New York City. And whenever the president went out in New York City, whenever Washington went out, he always had a black carriage drawn by 6 white horses, because that's what kings do. He would greet you at the president's house. He would hold an open house every other Tuesday. He always was in his full military uniform, sword at his side. He never would shake your hand. He would simply give you a stately bow as you entered. He would be accompanied by his wife, Martha, who would do the same. The reason, quite simply, it is beneath the dignity of the office for a president to shake hands. The president would never do that. Washington would never do that. And that is just a little tidbit of an example of how the office has changed. Can you imagine somebody running for president and declaring in their candidacy, because of my high view of the office of the President of the United States, I will not be shaking hands with anybody as I'm out campaigning. They'd be laughed off the stage. Today, an integral role of being president is being a man of the people and shaking hands. But that's something that's evolved. This was just Washington's personality. He was a formal person, he had a high view of the office, and he believed that the dignity of the office had to be maintained. Something else, he would never speak for or against any bill before Congress. That would be playing politics. He would never use his veto unless he believed a law was unconstitutional. Because again, simply to veto a bill because he didn't like it, that's political, and that's beneath the dignity of the President of the United States. He never spoke for or against a member of Congress, because once again, that's beneath the dignity of the office of the President of the United States. The king does not get involved in politics. He has a prime minister to do that. And in the same way, George Washington believed he should not be involved in politics. The Senate, the House of Representatives will take care of that. Well, that is one way of doing the office of the president, and it lasts a while, a generation or so. But by the time we get to the 1830s, things have changed. Those founding fathers, the Jeffersons, Madisons, Washingtons, they've all died off. And in this second generation of leaders, there is a change in the way the office of president is viewed. That comes manifest most obviously in Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was president in the 1830s, and he was the first president to clearly and intentionally identify himself as a man of the people. Washington was certainly popular, beloved by millions of Americans, but Washington always saw himself as above them, and he intentionally insisted that he was above the average person. Jackson was loved and hated. He was somebody who saw himself as a man of the people. He was the first president to be that sort of backslapping guy, the guy who would sit down and have a drink with the locals in a bar. He was very much very comfortable with the average person. He himself had sort of a challenging upbringing where he was orphaned as a teenager, kind of made his way out to Tennessee and self-made man, and while he was a millionaire and all of that sort of thing, he nevertheless considered himself just a man of the people, and he chose his close advisors, people that were his friends, not people from the high ends of society, and this was something that made him both loved and admired by certain people, but feared and hated by others. Another president I want to talk about is William Henry Harrison. He is a president who's the answer to the trivia question, who served the shortest term? William Henry Harrison is elected in 1840. He gives the longest inauguration speech at the time recorded, over 2 hours. It's in a pouring rain, and he gets pneumonia and dies in 30 days. He only serves as president for 30 days, but he's the first president to die in office. And the reason I mention him, beyond the trivial pursuits fact of this, is that it was a bit of a problem because we didn't know quite what to do next. Does the vice president become the next president? Is there another election? The Constitution was somewhat clear on this, but not as clear as most people liked. And it does set up the first time of a presidential succession. This was not something that was popular. The person who was vice president, John Tyler, was referred to not as His Excellency, but simply as His Accidency, because that was how he came into the office. Abraham Lincoln is president of the United States in the 1860s during the American Civil War. Throughout the 19th century, with the exception of perhaps Lincoln and Jackson that we just talked about, Congress was the power of the United States. Most of the important power was held in Congress. Most of the famous Americans were senators or members of the House of Representatives. But Lincoln and Jackson are the exceptions, and Lincoln is the last great president of the 19th century. He is president during the American Civil War. And as president during the American Civil War, he took it upon himself to greatly expand presidential power. He understood that this was a national crisis. And for example, he imprisoned over 15,000 American citizens in the North who he considered a threat to national security. This idea is not a new one. It's not something that's simply come up with the War on Terror. But as long ago as the 1860s, President Lincoln would imprison people without right of habeas corpus because he considered them a threat to the war effort. He does a magnificent job. He's usually considered either the greatest or second greatest president, depending upon which poll you look at, George Washington being the other. After Abraham Lincoln is a man named Andrew Johnson. He actually takes over when Lincoln is assassinated. And Johnson is distinctive simply because he is the first president to be impeached. I mentioned in our last lecture that presidents can be impeached. It does not mean they're found guilty. It means they're put on trial. And Andrew Johnson was the very first president to be put on trial, simply for political reasons. There were issues between Andrew Johnson and Congress over how Reconstruction or how our country ought to be put back together. Certain leaders in the House and Senate felt it ought to go one way. Andrew Johnson felt it ought to go another. Means were contrived to put him on trial for violating the Tenure of Office Act. He was found innocent, but he was found innocent by only one vote, and this virtually handicapped him the rest of his presidency. Well, power in the United States dissipates from the president's office during the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Most of the names of presidents then are not household names, people like Garfield, Hayes, Arthur, Harrison. The next president that we want to talk about is Theodore Roosevelt. He becomes president in the early 20th century, 1901. He is the first progressive president. And what is important about Theodore Roosevelt is that he does the same thing that Abraham Lincoln does, but without the emergency. Abraham Lincoln expanded the powers of the office of the president, but he had the context of the American Civil War in which to do so. Theodore Roosevelt expands the powers of the president without a national emergency. We aren't at war. It is simply a time in American history when change is happening, and the president begins to assert himself as the leader of the country in ways that Congress cannot. And this marks the beginning of the change from power being held in Congress to power being held in the president. It doesn't stay there. Congress takes over after a while, and it goes back and forth. But Theodore Roosevelt is the president who does the most to expand the powers of the presidency without a national emergency. And then the next president that we want to talk about is Franklin Roosevelt, a distant cousin. He is president during the Great Depression and World War II. This is the 1930s and 40s. And Franklin Roosevelt is the first modern president. And let me explain what I mean by that. He understood the power of the media. In the 20th century, at the time of Franklin Roosevelt, the 1930s, radio is the media that is booming around America. 90% of American households have radios by 1940. Okay, he understood the power of that, and he uses his beautiful voice wonderfully with these fireside chats to have these conversations with the average American. He is the first president who understands the significance of this and how to use it, how to take advantage of that. There had been media before, obviously there was newspapers and things like that, but they really hadn't been used as political weapons as effectively by the president as Franklin Roosevelt does. That's why we consider him the first modern president. He understood the power of the media, and he is the person who makes the president the most important person in the country. By the time we get into the 1940s with World War II, and then the atomic age following that, the president is clearly considered the center of political power in America. Now, that's not to say that they rule arbitrarily. We've talked about this before. They have to have dealings with Congress and interactions with them. But by the time we get to the 1950s, 60s, and on into the end of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, it's clear that the president is, as an individual, far more powerful than the president of the Senate or the Speaker of the House or any particular senator or representative. So these are the men that have changed the American presidency throughout the years. You can see the gap that's come from someone like Washington to our current president, from a person who had no sense that politics ought to be something a president does, who had no sense of getting involved in the media, to somebody who recognizes that that is simply part of the role of being the president today.